everyone, and welcome to another episode of Voices of the Resistance, where we give a platform for anyone who is fighting radical Islamic terrorism across the world. I am Will Selber, the owner of Grumpy Combat Veteran Media. I'm also known as GCV6, or other names, and that's okay with me too. I am delighted to have a couple of all-stars from the Global Friends of Afghanistan here on our show. Listeners of Voices of the Resistance or any of our podcasts will be familiar with Jason Howk, the leader of Global Friends of Afghanistan, a retired major who did multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have Hosna Jalil, who is a former deputy minister inside of Afghanistan, the former Afghan government's Ministry of Interior, which I used to be an advisor for a long time ago. And after the fall of Afghanistan, she has been busy working with Jason to help their vision to partner with our Afghan brothers and sisters, who I always say are trapped behind enemy lines. Welcome to Voices of the Resistance, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Will.
Yeah, it's a
Good to be
pleasure.
back.
Yeah, man. I think you're like the most frequent guest. So, Hosna, I think a few days ago, we're recording this on the 11th. A few days ago was International Women's Day. With the current situation in Afghanistan, I just would like to hear your perspective on the current situation for women in Afghanistan.
Most of the times when we are talking about August of 2021, we do claim that Afghanistan went 20 years back. That's partially true in a sense that the same ruling regime took over. They're deciding on women's freedom, how women should think, what should they say, where should they move, or should they be able or allowed to move at all across the country. Should they work? Should they still be breadwinner for their orphan children, particularly for women who have been the sole breadwinner for their families? On the bright side of it, it's a whole different generation of women. So we did not go 20 years back exactly the same way where we started in 2001. It's a whole different generation. They resist. And I do remember that pre-2001, we did not resist. I was an 8 or 9 years old child. I had a mother who was a medical doctor. People had accepted Taliban's ruling regime as their fate. And that's not the case today. So there's a dark side of what's happening in Afghanistan, or how things have moved since 2021, and there's a dark side of it.
One of the things I always say, if you want to see some of the most courageous people in the world, just Google Afghan female protesters and just be in awe of their courage to stand up to a gender apartheid regime, even though they will likely face consequences. I'm just always in awe of the resilience of Afghan women after the fall of Afghanistan. They've been at the forefront leading the charge. I just wanted to add that comment. Go ahead.
I think partially it's because they had seen a better life. When I say that people pre-2001 women did not resist, is not because I'm passing any sort of judgment to the generation that I grew up with.
Sure.
It's because they came from civil war and ended up under the Taliban's ruling regime. But this generation, they had a better life. There was a hope created. They could see a future. And to this day, after 3 years, they're fighting for the same future that they had in mind. That is what makes them different, very different than previous generations. On the dark side of it, for the last 3 years, Taliban gradually, I would say, oppressed them, suppressed them, and limited more and more the opportunities they had, the freedom they had, the rights they had, and they continue to do so. So it's a non-stop operation, and the limitations they would impose on the rights, on the freedom, on the opportunities of women, that would grow, that would not be less. For the last 3 years, there has been different allies and friends of Afghanistan. There have been different Afghan platforms, women taking the lead. They used every opportunity. They utilized every opportunity. They advocated, they fought, but it didn't lead to any behavioral change or policy change at the Taliban's end. And that is worrisome.
Yeah. I think that, the Taliban strategy, Jason, it seems to me has been like Hosna said, like this graduated increase in authoritarian or gender apartheid regime measures. And every step of the way, from my vantage point, they haven't been really held accountable for any of it. They just
Yeah.
keep on doing it a little bit more at a time. And we keep on moving the goalposts back. I don't know if you think that's an accurate read or not.
I think that's a really good read on it. They've been slowly dribbling it out because it wouldn't be a shock to the international community, because they really want that international recognition. I mean, just just today there were leaders in the Taliban regime saying, we've been doing everything we can, but why isn't the world recognizing us? And sadly, there's been this steady, the UN caving in on things, and nation by nation around the region, people have kind of given them diplomatic leeway. Just today, I saw one of the Taliban leaders in Oman sitting down talking in the Sultanate of Oman, which if Sultan Qaboos was alive, I don't think that would have happened. He is somebody who knew that you can't trust fanatics dressed up as religious leaders. You can't trust terrorist groups and insurgents, and so it's very frustrating. But I do think that is a strategy to just always slowly dribble it out. Not just, they're not just in mass shooting 40 women to try to shut up a village or a city. They're very smart about how they do it. They try to keep it as quiet as they can so that the world doesn't get too mad, and then they keep moving the goalposts. Yeah, it is frustrating.
It's, when I talk to people about with the Taliban and Al Qaeda and the Haqqani network, I like to just lump them all together because they're basically the same. All of these groups, their assassination campaign isn't centrally focused. That's not how it's going to roll down from the GDI. It's going to be haphazard at times where a Taliban commander maybe is in another place and he stumbles upon somebody. Oh, I remember you. Bam. And that's kind of how a lot of this, from what I see, is going on. But what I've also seen is like a steady increase in public executions, and going back to floggings and stuff like that. And it didn't take that long. It was maybe a year into it. Maybe I saw my first one. Maybe it was before that. And Hosna, maybe you could talk about this for my listeners. There is this idea that if we continue to engage with the Taliban, that they will become Taliban 2.0. The moderate Taliban, maybe Sirajuddin Haqqani, the New York Times Great Hope, is going to be part of that. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
When you mentioned Taliban 2.0, it brought a smile on my face. I remember back in 2020, all the women inside government, civil society, women in media, women in different sectors, women in NDSF, professional women as medical doctors, engineers who worked for mayors, different mayors' offices across provinces, women in governance, politics. They had, regardless of how different their political views on so many different things have been, they had a very united view on the Taliban's 2.0 version. And I'm repeating it here. It was that the Taliban hasn't changed. Their behavior and policies towards women would be the same. There's no Taliban 2.0. The only thing that makes them different than their previous version is that they are media savvy and they are trained diplomatically, and they're sharper to negotiate diplomatically because they're trained, and the money for that training is also coming from the West.
Yes.
So that's the only difference, that the Taliban, just a few, maybe less than a dozen, trained negotiators they have, and they have this huge group of media
Influencers,
I would say
social
influencers. Yes, very savvy.
If you follow me on Twitter, you'll see me engaging with them on a daily basis. They're my favorite people.
I do follow it quite frequently for a long time now. Yeah, so the Taliban 2.0 version that was imposed on Afghan women, that narrative was imposed on Afghan women back in 2019 and 2020. It's still being imposed, even though the world saw what the Taliban are, and that is very much aligned with the definition of Afghan women back in 2000, of how Afghan women defined them back in 2019 and 20. But they still continue to do so. My only question in that case would be, what would Western countries or even the regional countries who at times present themselves as they have sympathy with Afghan women, and at times they would present Taliban as the reality of Afghanistan to the Afghan women, like playing double side. What would they do different actually this time to prove that the Taliban 2.0 version is possible?
Yeah.
When it comes to how the Taliban's different factions are different, as New York Times is creating hope around Haqqani's network, is that yes, they might be different based on different interests. Any group can have different factions, different interests, different even political views. But at the end of the day, how, first of all, how does that make them less Taliban, make that one faction less of a Taliban in terms of how they're going to rule the country, how they're govern the country, and at the same time, how their policies and behaviors would be different? The second one is how influential they are. Are they able to take up arms or stand against their supreme leader? Do they have, okay, even if they have the intention, do they have the capability? The third argument I would present here is that why Haqqani network, as one of the factions of the Taliban, should have the right to rule the rest of Afghanistan. Do they really represent the entire Afghanistan? First of all, the Taliban does not represent Afghanistan. Yes, they can. I mean, we never ignore the fact that, yes, they might represent a small group in Afghanistan. And if there would be an inclusive government in Afghanistan at some point in time and people would vote like, okay, well, we do want some of them in that government, I think as an Afghan, I would respect the choice of Afghans, the votes of Afghans. But beyond that, if we would say, well, now because Afghanistan is in the hands of the Taliban, so, well, let's choose between the worst and the bad. Let's choose the bad. I would disagree with that.
Yeah.
I'm not, as an Afghan woman, I'm not going to vote for the bad. If I would have to resist, if I would have to fight, why shouldn't I fight for a better solution? That definitely, Haqqani definitely cannot be a solution for me as an Afghan woman. Definitely not. As an Afghan, first of all, not even a woman.
And I would say it as an American. Like, I find the whole thing offensive, disgusting, whatever. This has been a trend here in the American foreign policy circles, unfortunately, to shake hands with terrorists. We've seen it in Afghanistan with the Doha Agreement, and then Biden's retreat, and then him allowing Sarah Juden Haqqani to travel last summer to go to the Hajj. That was a really smart idea. Just let him go to the Gulf countries with all of the donors. I hope somebody told the Air Force commander that he was there. And you see all of these people, especially in Syria with Jelani, and I'm not going to get into that bag of tricks, but it's the same type of thing where we see somebody who used to be Al-Qaeda, whatever, and they go, I'm not with them anymore. In fact, I'm going to wear this suit to prove to you that I have changed. And I tell you, you talked about it earlier, Hosna, when you said that they're skilled negotiators. Yes, they're very good. And they know exactly who they're talking to. People with short attention spans who are trying to make progress happen because of an election cycle. And they play it masterfully. You know, I don't know, Jason, I think that one of our primary problems, and there's tons of them from America's war in Afghanistan, was that we didn't really understand who we were facing, and that their narrative was influencing us more than our narrative was influencing them. I don't know. What do you think?
No, absolutely. Yeah, the last couple of years before the collapse, Sadiq Siddiqui and I were constantly trying to bounce off each other on social media to get the NATO coalition and to get the Afghan government to really ramp up how they lead the narrative and not wait to be reactive and just get out there and drive it and undercut the narratives that the Taliban used so well. And we were, getting after the press as well to stop falling for, these so-called experts telling them the Taliban have changed. Nobody listened, really. In the end, everybody just slowly got rolled over by the ability of them to be so tech-savvy and communication savvy. They're good at it, and they're still doing it.
I remember sitting in the embassy having conversations with some of the Afghan government's negotiators. This was during the talks after the Doha Agreement, the intergovernment talks, and I would talk to them, and they like uniformly, this is a waste of time. All they're doing is stalling and waiting for you to leave. Like the constant message. And so, and we played right into it by pressuring the Afghan government and then leaving and really offering them on a silver platter to our enemies.
Yeah.
You know, Hosna, when we talk about the current situation in Afghanistan, you mentioned, the plight of the Afghan women. I want to kind of talk a little bit more about just all the current refugee status that's going on in the United States. There's been a lot of, consternation about if SIVs or if P1s, P2s, and whatever inside the Trump administration will continue on. I was wondering if you had any comments or thoughts on what's been going on the immigration front.
Well, I have been in touch and working with my former colleagues from the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, whose primary threat comes from the fact that they have been serving an Afghan government who was supported and was pro NATO and the US forces, and mostly with women, primarily with women. It took us 3 years to find ways to help them. Department of Defense have been graciously helpful. Some of them, a few of them actually, arrived in the US. Some of them were moved from one country to the other. Some of them who have been in Iran, they had to change their location to another third country where the US could have the resources to help them and the means to help them. Some of them are transferred even to Qatar, just waiting for their flight. And then the travel ban started, and the P1 and P2 visas and SIV and all the other immigration programs were seized. I think I start my mornings every day with tons of messages where people would text me like, okay, where should we go? People are transported to Qatar waiting for their flight. They have been waiting for their flight for a couple of weeks. The only option they have to go back is Afghanistan, and we all know what would happen to them the moment they would land in Afghanistan. And what bothers me even more is the fact that media in the West, in regional countries, of course, there have been some sort of sympathies for the Taliban. But in the West, we have been counting on the West much more than regional countries all the time. Because we as Afghan women, we did believe, and even ANDSF, I'm not just talking about the Afghan women, I'm speaking on behalf of 500,000 soldiers and fighters on the ground. Yep. We did resonate with the West more. And then what bothers me even more is that the media in the West are so political. That if I would tell them that, hey, you know what the Taliban are doing to the former ANDSF? Do you know how many disappeared officers and soldiers are in Afghanistan? We don't even know where they are. Are they killed? Are they in prisons? Do you know how many people are inside the prisons being brutally tortured in the most inhuman way?
Yep.
They would censor Will.
Yeah.
I remember that some of my interviews, the statements that I made about what women are going through inside Taliban's prisons, what the ANDSF are going through the Taliban's prisons, for whatever reason, maybe because of, for whatever excuses, not reasons. Maybe that's this is a violent language, or the wording is not appropriate for Western media to be portrayed. But that's the reality, that's the fact. It has been censored. So what bothers me even more is the fact that even as an Afghan woman, when we are trying to portray facts, it's being censored. Yeah. And that, of course, if I would say okay, what would happen to a woman who's going to go back from Qatar to Afghanistan having an active P1 or P2 case, what would happen to that person? There's no platform that I can even raise my voice anymore. Yeah. I'm silenced. Afghan women are silenced inside Afghanistan and even outside Afghanistan because we are no longer politically relevant.
Bingo. That was, oh wow. I couldn't have said that any better myself. The only thing I'd add, and this is just me, is that I think back in our mind, there's this shame. And nobody really wants to talk about it because it's not politically advantageous to any side. Because then they can just go like this. Well, you signed the Doha agreement, and then you did this, and then you did the retreat, and then you did this. And that's, nobody wants to say the truth. And it's always been so aggravating for me, Jason. You wrote about it early, like, AWOL generals and stuff like that, of one of your early articles, and I see these voices coming back, and I'm happy to have them back, that are advocating for Afghan women. But it feels like a repeat of history. I saw these same people, like 10 years ago in Kabul, fighting for Afghan women. And then it just feels to me that so many of them, when it came, because they were probably more liberal, when it came to when Biden when retreated, there was a lot of mute voices on the side of the aisle where you would traditionally think that they would have voices. I don't know, Jason. Am I wrong? Did you see that? I don't know, man.
Yeah, I absolutely saw that from Europe and the U.S. especially. The typical feminist movement, which is more vocal, coming from the Democratic Party. Angry when Trump did something, pretty silent when the decisions were being made and there was a chance to sway it. Very silent. Then angry afterwards, but talk about it. Don't do anything that's going to politically cause waves. And now Trump's back in. They'll ramp back up, hopefully, and start to be louder. But I don't know what that does. Yeah. They're not going to move Trump's decision making.
No.
And you don't have, it's just a mess. You've got people. I agree with Hosna Jalil. There's those women are no longer politically expedient for either party, so they're not going to get their voices out there. It's going to be, oddly enough, a lot of soldiers and veterans out there that are amplifying the voices of women. Women veterans and male.
Yeah. Yesterday we did an episode with Rebecca Edmondson of Next Mission, and she talked about the Afghan female tactical platoons. I mentioned that there was over 3,000 Afghan women, I think, in the ANSF at the fall. I think more or less. And, there were Afghan Air Force pilots. I think there was a squadron commander. So, Hosna, one of the common arguments is that the Afghans didn't fight and that they just kind of, they just stopped and it's not our fault and they did it. I would love to hear your thoughts on that as someone who is intimately involved with the Ministry of Interior and knows many people who served in Afghanistan.
Well, I remember when this narrative was pushed across the world. I was a fellow at the National Defense University, where people used to discuss Afghanistan as a case study on a daily basis, every day. That was, for me personally, it was a heartbreaking narrative. But on the sides who used to push that narrative because it politically saved people's images, administration's images, countries' images, right? I found that unfair and unethical.
Yes.
By all means, very unethical. And I remember when we used to do discussions, it was my country, it was my home. I did receive comments where Afghanistan's forces, 500,000 forces almost, we had 194,000 not all of them have been forces, but employees, right?
Sure.
In the Ministry of Interior and around 200,000 in the Ministry of Defense. They're like, well, we trained, we equipped, we gave the money, we gave the salaries, and they didn't fight and they ran away, they surrendered. And then Ukraine was invaded by Russia. That exacerbated that narrative. And Zelensky was the social media hero overnight, right?
Sure.
Who used social media for diplomacy. And I remember how Ukraine and Zelensky was compared to Afghanistan's forces. And I had one response. To this day, I have that one response. And when on behalf of Ukraine, excluding Ukraine, there would be a negotiation and Ukraine, I would say the winner would be Russia in that case. Trust me, Will, I'm going to write something about my experience of how Ukraine was compared to Afghanistan. So here's the thing. My response back then was the same. I Back then, of course, I mean, 3 years ago, I wasn't politically at the right time to make my argument more solid. But I think it's making more and more sense what I used to argue, and that is one thing. Where Ukraine was in 2021, we were in 2001.
Yep.
Ukraine had just started the war. We had fought that war for 20 years. What brought us to our knee was the political negotiation with the Taliban, excluding us, giving the Taliban every legitimacy and taking away every legitimacy we had in 2020 by our supporters, by our strategic partners. They left us alone in the middle of a battlefield, right? That's what's happening to Ukraine. Not in the same format, maybe not the same context. It might be very different than Afghanistan. But I did find it very unfair to compare Ukraine with Afghanistan. We had fought that war for 20 years and Ukraine had just started it. I will see when Ukraine, on behalf of Ukraine, there would be a negotiation excluding Ukraine, how Ukraine would be able to fight and would have any hope to win that fight. And I remember when I was in touch with my colleagues, the Taliban had not entered the palace yet. I remember that the soldiers, because the political system was broken down, there was no leadership anymore. The soldiers, the fighters, the commanders were told to surrender from different sources. When you don't have the political leadership anymore, I mean, what do you expect from a soldier? Who should the soldier fight for? I mean, yes, they can fight for their country. The moral was there, right? But they still needed the leadership, and the leadership had not collapsed in August of 2021. The leadership was on its way to collapse, the political leadership and structure, and I would say, the structure.
Yeah.
Back in February 2020. Because that leadership was no longer legitimate, and then it took another 1.5 years to even I would say, exacerbate that delegitimization process in a way that, well, we were made to believe that there's a Taliban 2.0 version. They represent 75% rural Afghanistan. They have changed, of course. This government is not legitimate because it did not bring enough vote. It still went through a very democratic process, regardless of the number of votes compared to the previous rounds. So it took another 1.5 years to even more delegitimize that government more and more. So I think for me, like if I make it brief, that experience of telling me that the Afghan fighters and soldiers did not fight for their own country. I was a civilian. I was not in the forefront. I was in a supporting role for all those young men and women. They fought without salaries. They fought without food. I visited them in 34 provinces. They fought in very harsh environment, and they still kept the Afghanistan's flag up. So for me, it breaks my heart if somebody.
It breaks my heart every time I hear it. For me, it's an insult to my friends that died, like General Sohrab Azimi and other Afghan soldiers that I personally knew. They were killed by the Taliban. It's Jason. When I hear this type of stuff, first, it's always from most of the time people that have never been in a war before and they don't know anything about Afghanistan. My counter to that narrative is always the same. I'm like, hey, look, the Taliban's ally, Pakistan, stayed in the fight. They had their resources coming. We're the ones that left the battlefield, pulled our enablers, and then blamed the very people who we took everything away from for losing a war. I don't know. It still infuriates me because it's a common narrative that I hear all the time.
Yeah, I think Hosna nailed it there. It wasn't politically expedient for anybody to say that we were at fault. It was, you could easily blame the Afghan people and those fighters on the front line. And I agree. We trained up a military that could be a NATO partner and could plug in and play and fight in the way we do it, and the way we fight wars. And then we took every resource away you need to do that before they had mastered it. I mean, it was only a 16-year-old, 16 or 18-year-old kid is ready for the world. It takes another 20 years to become an expert at what you want to do. And so you can't just throw somebody out into the fight, take all their resources and say, what happened?
Yeah, and you know, for our listeners, you know, the Afghan military, I mean, like they had some great like heavy hitters like Anasoc, 333, all the
Yep.
zero units. The fact that the Afghan Air Force, when I was the last year, I had never really engaged with the Air Force. I had trained the Afghan local police and some other things. But when I started to see these pilots, that's when I was like, okay, that's impressive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these Afghans learn, they go to America, they learn how to speak English. It's like their sixth language. And then they go and they compete, right? I'm like, oh my God. And then they go and compete. They go to the same schools as American second lieutenants. And like, if you go back and look at some of those graduation pictures, which I did recently, nothing but proud, nothing but like beaming with pride to be like an Afghan Air Force. I don't care, A-29 pilot. I mean, that's a stunning achievement for any human to do. To go to another country, learn the language, and then learn how to fly
Yeah.
against really smart American cadets.
It's that part was probably the most mind blowing, was seeing the growth of the Air Force, because I was there when the fourth condoc was created. We were
Yeah.
just like, we can make light infantry. That's probably what we can do. What about the Air Force? Yeah, we're gonna have to fly for them for a long time. And then all of a sudden, a couple of years later, we're making an Air Force. And you're right, these guys are getting up to 84, 90% accuracy with their munitions and close air support. And they're doing it old school sometimes because they're that good of pilots. That's stunning. That is absolutely stunning. Of course, we just took all the things they need to stay in the air away from them at the end, and
Yep.
they had to just go park them in other countries because
You know,
otherwise
yeah.
it's Taliban.
You know, Hosna, you talked a little bit about like how the Afghans fought in some really hard terrain. I was there the last year, watching it kind of crumble, and I can just remember, you know, I was like, how are you guys operating out there? Because it was all their logistics systems, and like some of them weren't getting paid. And I would always, when I hear somebody be like, "Oh, they're corrupt. They're gonna fold because this and that," always my thing was, what American soldier would stay on a post while not getting paid without a guarantee that if something happens to me, I'm going to get world class medical treatment to make sure that I can still, you know, get a prosthetic limb? You know, for the Afghan soldier, policeman, whatever, that was never the case, right? If you got injured in combat or lost a limb, maybe you get a little money, but probably not that much. And then you have to learn how to become a breadwinner as a disabled combat veteran. I'm sure you saw plenty of that at your time inside the Ministry of Interior. If you could talk a little bit about that, about what you saw from those Afghan police officers.
We used to have 62 to 64,000 families of martyred colleagues or disabled colleagues. Okay, let me tell you a story,
Okay.
which is very close to my heart. We did have a colleague of mine, an officer, police officer, who was martyred in a combat situation. And I remember that, well, his mother was living in a suburb area of Kabul. So I could travel for like an hour and I could visit the family. I was told that somebody should visit the family because another brother of the same family was martyred in the front line in the army. He has been apparently an army officer a month ago. So in 1 month, a mother was receiving 2 dead bodies of his 2 sons, one in the army, the other in the police. I went to the family. I visited the family on behalf of Ministry of Interior. I visited the mother. I visited the orphan children from the 2 brothers and the widowed women of the 2 brothers. They apparently have been the only 2 men in the family. The mother who had received 2 dead bodies and the only 2 men in the family in 1 month, she did not cry. And I could understand that she might need some time to even be able to express her grievance. She was proud of the fact that her 2 sons had fought for their country. And I remember that she mentioned that if she had a younger son, she would send still the 3rd son to take up arms and defend their country. That was the incentive of the families, of the mothers, and of the soldiers. What we offered, what we could afford to offer the families, it was not something to incentivize a family to send their third son, was not a package that could incentivize somebody to fight for their country. When it comes to their logistical supplies, again, because I was taking care of the provincial coordination, so I was involved somehow in observing how the logistical supplies arrived. We did have a lot of issues with logistical supplies. We did have soldiers who had not received their salaries for months. And again, they have been the breadwinner for their families.
Sure.
And they still fought for their countries. When it comes to the medical treatment that they received, these are just examples of the services that we could offer them while they were serving their country. It wasn't that much, but they still took pride in serving their country. And I do remember it bothered me when we did receive, even from some of our advisors, that most of the forces are fighting for the money. That wasn't the case. What was the amount? Well, you served there. What was the
not
amount
much.
that they used to receive? $200.
You know, but I mean, good for Afghanistan, but like, that's not why you do that. I mean, you know.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. If somebody fights in the front line and they don't know if they would come back alive, that was an amount that they could make. Yes, it was good enough to feed their families. But if we compare the context, they could have maybe a job in a different sector. But that sector did not offer that pride that they could take in serving their country.
And I would also underscore, Hosna, before you continue, just one point, that for these men and women who served, the front lines was also their homes. And so when you volunteered, your family went with you, because if they found out where you live, then they use that to go after them. So I would like to know how many American soldiers would be willing to volunteer to go to a war knowing that in the rear, while you're fighting, somebody might be hunting for your family. And it's a level of courageousness that is, I think, not often underscored enough.
Yeah, so I think the reason that they used to fight for their country, we cannot say 100%. There might be a percentage of the forces who would fight for the money. They need that as a source of employment.
Sure.
But we cannot generalize that as that very tiny portion of the forces throughout the forces, right? To me, I mean, having served with them in a civilian capacity, I'm always emotionally invested, and I always would be grateful regardless of which situation we are in right now, who is ruling the government. Did we lose the war or did we not lose the war? I'm always grateful for their services as an Afghan woman, and they definitely have been a reason why as a little girl and then grew up as a woman, I've been able to study and to serve my country again. They provided that opportunity for me, all these forces that we are talking about. And there are thousands and millions of Afghan women and girls who do believe that they owe whatever they have achieved so far in the last 20 years. Definitely the international presence is something that we are grateful for. And definitely that's the Afghan forces who put their lives in the front line to make sure that we are able to get that opportunity.
I would, very well said. I'll tell a little story. The last year in Afghanistan, an American pilot went down. And it was the Afghan Air Force Special Mission Wing that launched a CSAR mission that picked up that downed American pilot. You can Google it if you'd like. It was on Afghan television. That's, when I tell people that, they're always taken back by it. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, they went out there and risked their lives to save one of their advisors. And let me tell you, I saw all the pictures, and it's just a bunch of proud Afghans. And I would talk to them. They're like, we were able to go and get one of our advisors, like beaming with pride. And we've talked a lot about things that are going wrong in Afghanistan, and we could do that all day. But to kind of, end a little bit on some optimism. Hosna, if you could tell my listeners, what do you think, the West, America, or the average American can do to help Afghan women, and then also ANSF officers who are still in Afghanistan?
Most of the times when we are talking about all what went wrong, there's always a question of why the coalition have been present in Afghanistan. It has basically been not been useful at all. So why do we have complaints about the rushed withdrawal? Not the withdrawal, but the rushed withdrawal. Why do we grieve about how the coalition withdrew from Afghanistan? So my response is that no, the presence has not been useless at all. It left, if there's one thing that I would consider as a positive legacy of that 20 years engagement, that is definitely the generation we are talking about right now. That 20 years legacy left a generation behind who are warriors, by all means. Be it a young girl who has been a student and is denied education, be it a young boy who had the ambition to connect with the rest of the world and be part of the rest of the world and not be imprisoned by the Taliban. I think that's the generation that has been the legacy of the last, on the bright side of whatever we are discussing today, of the last 20 years of engagement. When it comes to what the Western countries that we have looked up to for the last 20 years can do, I think as much as they're engaging with the Taliban as a de facto regime, I wish they had engaged with all these different factions of Afghans as much as they did engage with the Taliban.
Yes.
I mean, as an Afghan woman, I do not complain about the fact that people are talking to the Taliban. The talks, the dialogues, I would say, discussions should always be there. But there should be a balance to that discussion of the Taliban, the anti-Taliban, and the non-Taliban. I can see that the engagement with the Taliban, the talks, the discussions with the Taliban is much more than the other factions. So I do believe that engagement is something that we are really hoping for, that should be there with all the non-Taliban and anti-Taliban factions too. The second hope that I have is, I mean, I'm using this word hope because I'm in no position to recommend anymore. I'm in no position to advise anymore. And I don't believe that my voices have been heard or anyone else's voices is being heard in the last 3 years, regardless. I mean, on top of that, sometimes I felt like I'm being censored. So my second hope is that when an Afghan talks about the Taliban, and who the Taliban are and what we think about the Taliban, it should be taken as a valid point.
Yes.
We shouldn't be silenced because we oppose the Taliban. I remember that in platforms like Doha Forum, when I spoke against the Taliban, I was stopped by a senior UN official, a woman. And after the engagement or the panel discussion, she was trying to convince me that I'm wrong about the Taliban. Well, I lived all of my life. A previous Taliban regime, since I was born, I was in Afghanistan. I lived during the Civil War. I mean, I was born during the Civil War. When I remember, while growing up, since the time that I remember, that was the previous Taliban's regime. And then we, of course, had the 20 years of international community's engagement, and I finally ended up in the US, hoping that I would go back home one day. And I do find it insulting when a senior UN official, a woman, is stopping me at a forum like Doha Forum and telling me how wrong I am about the Taliban. So I do believe my second hope is that when an Afghan, particularly an Afghan woman, is talking about the Taliban or expressing themselves about the Taliban should not be immediately dismissed and should be heard.
Yes.
We have lived the lives that everybody is talking about. Yes. And it does bother me on the edge of this conversation. I want to mention that it does bother me when I, as an Afghan woman, am dragged in a conversation to tell my story as a victim, how Taliban victimized me so that everybody else can discuss how to solve my problem. I don't want to just be the problem and express like, hey, you know what, I'm the problem and I need everybody else to solve me as a problem or my problem. No, I don't want to be that well. And that definitely bothers me how Afghan women in most cases are being treated. And if I would be like, okay, well, this is my observation, this is my analysis of the situation, and this is how I would recommend, I would say, or this is what I see as a solution, I would not be considered credible anymore, as far as I go beyond the victim who tells a story. So yes, I do hope that Afghan women and in general Afghans would be considered as credible sources to come up with their own solutions as well. Wow. Not just like expressing like, hey, you know what, I'm in trouble and this is my situation, can you please help me? I think at some point in time, I do believe early in 2001, there has been very positive intentions to come up by the non-Afghans to come up with solutions. And I've always been grateful and appreciative of that. But I think we have grown, we have passed that phase.
Yes, God,
so
please.
I definitely hope that we would be treated as people who are capable of coming up with solutions as well. And the third one, when it comes to the Afghan and DSF particularly, who are inside Afghanistan or in third countries, I really hope that they should not be abandoned, because I do know what it means for them to be abandoned. They would either be disappeared, that's our experience of the last 3 years, or they would be tortured inside the Taliban's prisons. There still are some of them there, or they would be killed. Yeah. That's what we for sure know. And there's no fourth, I would say, scenario in that case. And I really hope that the ban that is for the dismissal of the refugee process for the NDSF, that would be reconsidered.
Yes, that was very well said. I'll just say that. I think that I echo all of those points. And I would just add that, like, you know, what you can do to help is to actually engage, to actually just take a couple of minutes out of your time, you know, put down the whatever distraction and just read an article about Afghanistan and what's going on there. And maybe talk to some people American veterans who have fought there and what they feel about the war that they spent their entire lives fighting. You know, for us, Jason, and I'll close it out with this question, and then Hosna, if you want to offer any comments, feel free. You know, for a generation of American combat veterans, this was their identity, right? Afghanistan.
True.
You know, for me, it was learning the languages as much as I could and really reading as much history. But there's a generation of American combat veterans that believed. And I think if Americans listened to them, that would be one step towards helping Afghan women and the Afghan people. I don't know, Jason, what do you think?
Absolutely agree. And a number of them are in Congress now, and they're expressing what we need to do. And I think both parties need to listen to what those folks are saying, because we're echoing and we're trying to amplify what our friends from Afghanistan are saying. I wrote in a song once that we grew up in Afghanistan, and Hosna so wisely reminded me at a meeting one day that she grew up beside us too. And I think that's what I think the public and often our government leaders miss. You know, we are 20 years bonded together with our friends and comrades in Afghanistan. That's tight.
And I would just add before, Hosna, if you want to add any comments, that the Afghans fought, and actually there's no better ally than an Afghan. So it's actually the complete opposite, is that once you show loyalty and courage in front of an Afghan soldier, he will fight next to you to the bitter end. That was my experience. Hosna, would you like to wrap up with any comments for us?
I just want to use your podcast as a platform to speak to the American veterans who have served in Afghanistan. Jason, I remember that one of the reasons that we got connected and I joined GFA was Jason's song. It is a song that is very close to my heart, like word by word, like every single word of that. I remember that Jason mentioned about the suicide rate among the veterans, and I just wanted to, particularly those who have served in Afghanistan, I just wanted to remind them that kids like me who started going to school post-2001, we definitely grew up with your presence. We owe you and we are grateful to you as much as we owe our own forces. We learned good morning because of you guys, because we could see you guys coming to our campuses in school and distributing notebooks and other like school materials. we did look up to you guys as the good guys because you kicked out the Taliban and you did open the school doors for us girls. So I think if I would be a veteran having served in Afghanistan, any portion of my deployment, that would be my biggest achievement. That would be I would say the most meaningful part of my service, that Afghan women who grew up with you, who studied in your presence, and not just women, all these young boys as well. How much do they love you? How much do they look up to you, and still they do? So I just wanted to again pass the message that as much as we love our own forces, we do love you.
Wow. Wow, what a great way to end the episode. Hosna, thank you so much for taking the time out to come and join us. Jason, always a pleasure. Just for our listeners, do me a favor, share it with your friends, share it with your enemies, give us 5 stars, support the troops, all that type of stuff. And until next time, I hope everyone has a wonderful day.